Well, welcome. It's our final talk for the Humanities Alliance guest lecturer series. Today we're honored to have Dr. Steve Horn of the Political Science Department. Steve has been teaching at Everett for how long now?
It's like 18 years.
18 years, yeah. He's one of our great instructors, and I'm very honored to have him here today. Steve's talk is entitled, We Need Your Belligerent Uncle, Building Solidarity in the Trump Era or a Paradigm You Can Believe In. I'm looking forward to Steve's talk. I hope you are as well. Will you please give a warm welcome to Dr. Steve Horn.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks for having me today. First, I want to talk a little bit about the title. I think actually the title will become a little more clear what I mean as I go through the talk. But what I'm getting at here, we need your belligerent uncle. I want you to imagine as I'm talking the most regressive relative that you have in terms of politics. I'm gesturing towards that. The subtitle, Building Solidarity in the Trump Era, or a Paradigm You Can Believe In, I was sort of thinking about the way this topic came about when the Humanities Alliance met during the fall to figure out what topic we were going to settle on. And we eventually settled on the good life in the 21st century. And I had voiced a desire to think about providing hope, especially political hope, since I teach political science. And I remember, I can't remember who in the group, but there was a little bit of, oh great, we're going to hear about some things that aren't really doable, that maybe a kind of, we talk nice about hope, but really, do we believe in it? And so my challenge as I constructed this was to try to live up to the promise of providing actual hope. That is a path forward. And I thought for this talk especially, I should give you the argument right off the bat. So I want to do that. So, and by the way, I hope to finish this. I haven't actually timed how long this takes, but I hope to finish this with a lot of time to have a conversation afterwards. But here's the argument. As our declining neoliberal order confronts a variety of crises and political disruptions, the stakes of finding a strategic path forward become ever higher. Our current politics have generated at least three competing options. The first, offered by the political right, dangles an age-old divide and conquer lure that tempts the majority white population against minorities and other marginalized groups. This is, of course, no solution, and is likely to lead to fascism or its cousin, Christian nationalism. Meanwhile, the progressive left is divided. On the one hand, the dominant liberal identity politics of the Democratic Party focuses on efforts to reform biased attitudes and promote diversity in all sectors of society. On the other hand, there is an older, somewhat misunderstood and underappreciated left tradition of solidarity that seeks to organize the working class around a broad set of universalist goals that would repair, reconstruct, or reimagine institutions that and the social order from the ground up. This latter approach, I'm arguing, is a far superior option for progressives to follow. And ironically, it offers the best hope of achieving the main goals of liberal identity-based strategies. That's the argument. First, our era of crisis. And I thought this was summed up best by Adolf Reed Jr. in a piece called The Whole Country is the Reichstag recently. And he wrote, a key practical reason to stress the danger on the horizon in our political system is the possibility that the national and global political economic order we've known as neoliberalism has evolved to a point at which it is no longer capable of providing enough benefits, opportunity, and security to enough of the population to maintain its popular legitimacy. The result of this, the consequence of this situation has been the political disruption that I gestured at in the last page. And it essentially holds that roughly 80–90% of the public, of the population, is not doing well, is feeling more stress, has far less security, power over their own lives. We operate in an era of massive and growing inequality, mostly concentrated wealth at the top, income at the top. Professor Reed has also described this moment as one in which we face a T-shaped intersection where one path leads to fascism, authoritarianism. The other choice leads us to a more democratic, perhaps social democratic future. So we have three options, as I noted. The first, which I would argue is not an option at all, is right-wing identitarianism. It boils down to the age-old divide and conquer. It's always evolving, always shift-shaping according to what is needed to divide the larger population, make sure that it doesn't unify and try to rearrange the social order. And here you see Ron DeSantis, right? He, in my mind, is particularly problematic. My cards are on the table in terms of being anti-Trump, but one thing that I could say about Trump is, he was just sort of a buffoon and didn't know how the levers of government actually worked. But DeSantis, he looks like the kind of guy who could actually do it, who could actually hold that job and be a competent authoritarian. Now, what does this look like in practice? Well, I give lots of examples, but I thought these slides from Stephen Miller, former Trump advisor, these slides from screenshots from a political ad that he developed for the midterm elections that we had in November are particularly illustrative. Look at how, over the course of these slides, the effort is to divide, in this case, white versus black, right, in particular. And I should probably add something that I meant to say earlier. When we're thinking about these issues, they apply to a lot of different diverse categories of people, but my main analysis is going to be on race today, right? I think the conclusions remain the same, though, no matter who we're looking at. But look at these efforts to divide, right? And boiling it down, progressives discriminating against white Americans, right? I told you I could have chosen a lot of different examples, but really I could have chosen examples that are from today, yesterday, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. I could have gone all the way back from when Europeans landed on this continent. Hold on. Almost all the way back. Because that's not quite true. This book by Theodore Allen, The Invention of the White Race, is an extremely important book, and I'm sort of surprised that it isn't on every graduate student's reading list, because it should be. Why? Well, I think the quote up here is an important starting place. Here's the quote from Allen. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor, according to the colonial records, would there be for another 60 years. What does that mean? No white people there. What it means is that the people in 17th century colonial America, English settlers, thought of themselves as English settlers, or Christians, or Germans, or Italian, or Irish, or Scottish. They didn't think of themselves as white. many of these bonded laborers actually lived in close proximity to bonded African slaves. They interacted. They had leisure time together. They lived their lives together. And later in the 17th century, they rebelled together. In fact, during the 1660s, 1670s, a series of rebellions involving the combined efforts of bonded European labor, and bonded African labor, threatened to overthrow the planter elite in Virginia, the key colony to understand in this case. During Bacon's rebellion, they burned Jamestown to the ground and controlled six-sevenths of the colony. Now, eventually this rebellion was subdued, and there was a reaction by the ruling elite. What was the reaction? It was a slow but methodical creation of the white race. That is, they started giving privileges to people who were European laborers. They started grinding African labor even harder and creating the tyrannical version of slavery that we know and understand. And that was an important move. Allen calls this the poison bait for European laborers who had seen their interests align with African laborers throughout most of that century, but now were tempted to claim a white skin privilege. Right? In fact, this is the source of white skin privilege. Understand, this is not something that just arose naturally. This was something that was purposefully created. And Allen's argument is that this white skin privilege was used to clearly disadvantage African laborers, obviously, but also to disadvantage white laborers. That is to say, any white skin privilege that might be gestured at was very narrow. But ultimately, both sides were disadvantaged in powerful ways. So how do we think about this?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but how are both sides disadvantaged?
Well, we'll talk about that. But the most obvious way that whites were disadvantaged is they no longer had a clear path to challenge the hierarchical system in Virginia. They became more loyal to this newly created race than they were to people in similar conditions to them who were being exploited. So you have left over a broad exploited working class, but they're divided from each other because of these special perks and punishments, combination or codified into law. My point is this stuff didn't come naturally, right? I think the stamped from the beginning thesis is a bit off base and misleading then. It also means this can be fought. If it can be created, it can be fought, right? The question is how, right? So the first solution on offer, and this is the dominant solution on offer, is the liberal democratic identity politics solution. What's the focus there? You probably know, you could probably feed this to me. Rehabilitating individual bigoted attitudes, employing diversity training, acknowledgement of white privilege, right? Accounting for implicit biases that are clearly measurable throughout the population, right? Centering the most marginalized voices in the room and decentering whiteness, right? Reforming or rooting out quote unquote bad apples in law enforcement and elsewhere. Diversifying the workforce and positions of power. The bottom line here with this answer is change hearts and minds. make institutions look like America. So that's one response. I think this is what decent people do. I have a lot of sympathy for this solution, right? This path. Diversity, basic respect, our goals, any reasonable and thoughtful person, any reasonable society should support. And I think policies like affirmative action, excellent policy, right? There are, however, some crucial problems with this approach. First, does it work? Decades of research focused on whether diversity training actually produces better attitudes amongst people we want to change, say our belligerent uncle, doesn't work. The finding is that you need to have a good faith approach to diversity training, to healing your bigoted attitudes in order for that to be effective. But what that amounts to are situations where we're essentially in a diversity training situation preaching to the choir. Right? Meanwhile, for those who are compelled to join these sessions, the consequence is anger and backlash. Now, in one sense, you might say, well, who cares? But we need to care if we actually care about a political path forward. And I would point to the bar chart at the bottom here to show us about where we are, right? These are white working class votes for the 2016 election. Understand, these are people who should be voting for progressive candidates that want to improve working class conditions, right? They want to empower the working class, but they're choosing candidates who I don't think in any way, shape, or form do that in practice or want to do it. You have supermajorities of working class whites then preferring the Republican candidate. This is a failure of organization on the left, right? Getting back to, does it work? Does the liberal democratic approach work? Implicit bias. This is really important work in terms of what psychologists are doing to try to uncover unconscious biases and prejudices. The fact that we can measure this across an array of identities, race being a central example, shows that bigoted attitudes are all around us. The product, in part, of this poison bait decision that was offered hundreds of years ago. However, doing something about implicit bias is an entirely different thing. Psychologists don't know how to cure it or change it, right? Now, I would also argue that privilege discourse within this model misses the actual, a different way of framing a question of privilege, and offloads guilt and responsibility onto the individual rather than the wider society and the power relations that exist. And finally, a point that I've already made, this strategy does the rights work for it by dividing the working class and setting up a zero-sum framework in already desperate times. Right. Now, many of you will have watched the video that I had Charles send out for the students in this class. If you haven't, I can direct you to it in my list of sources at the end of this slideshow. But the video was made by a scholar by the name of Olufemi Taiwo, and he describes the effect of elite capture, and in particular in relation to liberal democratic identity politics, which he argues, and I agree, often gives progressive cover to elites in corporate and other institutional settings. An example that Taiwo gives is of a REI, diversity officer on an internal podcast, first identifying her pronouns and then giving a land acknowledgement before then saying, by the way, REI doesn't think you should organize into a union. Right, so in other words, progressive cover for a regressive message and policy. One way to kind of think about this would be land acknowledgements without giving back the land, right? Or if that's not possible, without doing anything about the fact that, for example, in King County, Native Americans represent 1% of the population, but roughly 15 to 30% of the homeless population. Sort of performative progressive politics does nothing to help those people. Symbolic politics, symbolic identity politics like this also requires very little from the comfortable. Doesn't change the material circumstances of anybody who might be considered marginalized, or anybody else for that matter. Also, elite capture does nothing, or identity politics does absolutely nothing in this form to change rotten institutions. So you can have a different looking set of leadership in an institution, but if the institution is rotten, the behavior is the same. An important point here is that when good people occupy bad institutional roles, the latter is what rules the day. So if you want to say, you know, you really should appreciate the leadership, they're all good people, that's fine. But they are constrained by the role they fill. And they wouldn't be in that role for much longer if they diverted beyond a certain scope of behavior, right? So, a thought experiment. Think about this. I think we have enough time to where I could take some answers. If every industry and all leadership positions in the country were distributed proportionately according to the demographic characteristics of the American people, would that be a just society? Also, if racial bigotry, sexism, and other identity-based bigotries ended tomorrow, would that be a just society? Thoughts?
Excellent questions.
I have an answer, shockingly. My answer, proposed answer. If position and power were distributed proportionately relative to every demographic category and bigotry were eliminated, society would be more just. But it would not be a just society. Not even close. If rotten institutions remained untouched, we would be left with a rainbow oligarchy as a replacement for our current predominantly white oligarchy. So what's the right answer? Well, my argument is that it's solidarity. which is a way of gesturing at working class organization around a broad set of universalist goals that would repair, reconstruct, or reimagine institutions and the social order from the ground up. That's the way to go. What are we talking about? We're talking about universal health care, affordable housing, free higher ed, taxpayer-paid higher ed, student debt relief, child care, living wage, pay for home labor, community control of police. I'm not talking about oversight. I'm talking about control. Equitable climate policy and building working class democracy. The focus here is on coalition building, creating a broad movement that, yes, will need to involve many of your belligerent uncles. But the goal is real material gains for the working class. Who is the working class? Well, Marx defined it as a matter of the relationship between you and the means of production. Capitalists own the production, you're a worker if you don't own the production. Doesn't quite work today when you think about Uber drivers, but I think there's another way to conceive of it. Working class is anybody who needs their job. If you lost your job and 6 months later you were in dire straits, guess what? You're a member of the working class. So you're part of this plan. So 80 to 90%, if not more, of the country is what we're focused on here. Now, one important consequence of this kind of politics is it has the promise, at least, of reducing the salience of the right-wing, racialized, and other messages focused on difference. I'm reminded of something that Adolf Reed says over and over if you watch any of his talks, and I've linked quite a few of them at the end of this presentation for you. When he made the case that, look, he cut his teeth in the civil rights movement. He worked with a lot of assholes in the civil rights movement, right? People who he disagreed with on many things, but they were still able to overcome that by focusing on what unified them. There's certainly going to be some people that you can't work with, and I don't recommend going out and finding the most racist person, white person you can find to join in common cause with. Right? That's not what I'm arguing. What I am arguing is this approach aligns with the strategy of the most important and successful movements in American history. In fact, I would argue virtually everything you like about this country has stemmed from these kinds of solidarity movements involving broad coalitions of people, diverse coalitions of people at their best moments. So where does progress come from? Anti-slavery movement, women's movements, labor movement, civil rights movement, the anti-war movements that we've had, the LGBTQ movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Now, what's this picture on the other side here? This is a reference to a group of radical, socialist, black feminists who in the 1970s were upset, justifiably, by being shut out of the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement, being shut out of the women's movement. They are the ones who coined the phrase identity politics, but it meant something very different to them than what it means in the mainstream discourse today. What it meant for these women was this was the path into class struggle. Hey, here's how capitalism is exploiting me. here is where I come into all of this. It wasn't about a siloed approach. It was about joining an avenue to the working class struggle, the class struggle to produce a better society. So the irony is that the solidarity path incorporates identity politics, but I think in a much more substantive and purposeful way. So I think, again, the irony is that the solidarity model offers the best hope of achieving the main goals of liberal identity-based strategies. So what I'm suggesting here, think about what I said about diversity training exercises. That doesn't work. What does work has actually been known for quite a while, starting with the examination of the experience of white and black soldiers during World War II, who, when they were studied, those soldiers had far reduced animus, racial animus, and a much greater willingness of white soldiers to work alongside blacks than those whose companies remained segregated. In other words, it was found a common struggle as equals was the path to reduce the very thing that identity politics is all about. That's the way forward. There's no guarantee, right? And in fact, the movements that I had on the last page, there was no guarantee, lots of struggle, lots of roadblocks. Many of the people who joined at the beginning of those movements never saw the end. So what I'm talking about here is a long-term, sustained effort with a broad array of potential payoffs. But repeated contact, struggling towards a common goal as equals is the path to reducing bigotry, and it's also the path forward to a more just society. One thing to think about here, of the significant factors that influence how a person will vote, the two most significant factors influencing the white working class vote is whether a person belongs to a union or a church, or if both, which they think is more important to them. So building unions, the primary institutional form of solidarity, is vitally important. And of course, we've seen a dramatic drop in unionization over the last 60 years in the United States. Have to build that back. Some final thoughts. So what are some things I would suggest we need to do as a result of all of what I've said? I would say at home that our colleges and institutions need to think about the way that our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are designed, right? I would argue that those programs need to center class struggle, which would provide a unifying analysis to all forms of oppression. So identity is an important avenue into this common struggle. For you, looking for ways to plug in, really important. Start a union, join a union, build solidarity when and where you can. Problem is not attitudes, the problem is power. Thank you. So we've got a good 25 minutes?
Yeah, maybe we have plenty of time for questions, comments.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Appreciate the talk a lot. So thinking about solidarity, especially working class solidarity, how do we overcome the social divisions within the working class?
how do we overcome the social divisions within the working class?
So thinking about how we've put so much focus in politics on, go back to the church, how we divide our political beliefs now based on our religious beliefs a lot of the times. So how within the working class can we find a way to overcome those divisions?
Really good question. I heard an interview yesterday, and I'm trying to remember who it was from, but it made the comment that there is a rising effort to unionize across the country right now, a reinvigorated effort to do that. And the commentator made the comment that in no instance were they aware that as those movements developed, there was dissension from within those movements based on race or religion or those kinds of categories. Again, when you're in that kind of struggle, I think the salience of the issues you're all facing sort of take over. And I'm certainly not saying that that kind of dissension can't arise. But we live in an imperfect world, and we have to do our best in the imperfect world. We don't have another one to choose from. Other questions or thoughts?
I got a follow-up kind of comment, and take it with a grain of salt, but I'm thinking about some of the older conversations around, in the Marxist tradition, and I'm sympathetic to Marxism up to a point, about building class consciousness, right? That a lot of Americans see themselves as, temporarily members of the working class. Someday I'm going to be a millionaire. I'm going to crush it, right? I'm not going to be a working class person forever, and that there's just not, unlike, France or England, Germany, European traditions, working class there was solidarity because there was consciousness. They were aware of what they were. I just think in America, everybody kind of thinks they're middle class on their way to becoming a millionaire influencer, right? And so I think that has to be addressed. That a lot of us, because they've done studies that. For most of us, the class that we're born into, or the class that we die in. There's not as much upward mobility as the myth of the American dream suggests. And so there's, we have to realize that, hey, we're all in this together, right? That there is a corporate oligarchy that kind of runs the show in this country, and the workers have been disenfranchised. When you look at housing prices, cost of tuition, medical care, the evidence for economic inequality is all over the place. And I think that's one of the things I'm taking away from Steve's talk, is that, those of us without a lot of money need to band together. And that's what I would call class consciousness.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to the first part of your comments that, maybe you can, attract a person like that who thinks they're going to be a budding millionaire someday. First you need some basics, right? How about healthcare? A good job, dependable, secure job, and that sort of thing. And then good luck, becoming a millionaire down the line. But Allen suggests the invention of the white race, that really a lot of the obstacle that we have to overcome was that poison bait of creating white skin privilege. And again, he invented that term in the 1960s, but it wasn't sort of this amorphous kind of vague thing that whites have privilege and other people don't. It was in relation to an unjust system and maintaining an unjust system that hurts everybody. So it's a narrow privilege that you need to kind of attack the assumption that you're actually getting something that's worth having versus what you could have. Yeah, and then Eugene.
I'm sorry. What role do you think, like a scarcity mindset, comes into play when you think about the working class constantly competing with one another, feeling like there's not enough money, or there's not enough this, there's not enough that they don't necessarily realize that the power and push is in coming together?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one to overcome, but I think I would raise the salience of what is achievable through collective solidaristic action. That if you want more of scarce resources, then you need to work together as a working class of people to make sure that all of it doesn't get captured by the very top, which it has in fact, done over the last 40 years. Eugene, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, how do you get people to realize that the scarcity model does not exist?
Conversations.
About this class, and
Yeah.
my students could say, I can't even think about overthrowing Dana's ridiculous power authority in her class because there's only so many A's. And I gotta get one of those A's. I can't take that A from this student or that student. So how do you get them to even understand that that concept of scarcity is a myth in some ways?
Well, sometimes it's a myth and sometimes it's not.
Sure.
Right? I think exploit the areas where it's not, and maybe think in terms of, well, let's make sure that the broad thrust of people like us get their share of what is, zero sum. But I don't know that I am the fountain of answers on this. I think what I'm describing is not a book where you have all the answers. It's about a process of working with other people, and you don't ultimately know where it's going to go, but hopefully somewhere more just than where it starts from.
I have to preface my comment with I'm aching for an argument today.
I was too.
You're probably the wrong person to argue with because ultimately we agree on the ends.
Yeah.
You mentioned that unions are the most important progressive institution that we have, and that the goal is a more just society. You and I, in the past 2 weeks, have talked about situations that are a direct result of union activity that institutionalize injustice.
Yeah.
Where does that injustice come from if the institution itself is the best hope we have for justice?
Yeah. Okay. I think what we were talking about was, I think, a reasonable point that our union tends to look out, the faculty union, tends to look out for tenured faculty a lot more than it looks out for 70% of your instructors who are adjunct faculty who have to piece together a schedule, who don't have any security. They serve at the will of the college. They're union members, but on the first page of our agreement, it basically says, we can get rid of you. That's the message, at least. And I think the structure of the union does lead towards what you're suggesting, right? So tenured faculty have a certain interest in a certain kind of approach to management, administration, and it often doesn't take enough account of the needs and insecurities of people who have the same degrees as them. They're just as qualified, just as good at teachers, right? But I would take a bigger picture look at that. After all, it's the state and the institution itself that decided to hollow out the profession and decided that 70% of our faculty are going to be basically exploitable and exploited. And they don't just feel exploited, they are exploited. They feel that way because they are, right? Now, in part, it's not the state or the institution's fault, in part. Although I would like to see my party, certainly, and my administration here, fight for adjunct rights and power a lot more than they do. But a lot of this is the consequence of tax revolts, especially in the 1970s, of Reaganomics in the 1980s, that basically pulled the rug out from under institutions like community colleges. So now we rely on what are called part-timers, but many of them are full-time and definitely want full-time if it became available. And we do some other things to sort of do higher ed on the cheap as well. I'll leave that for another conversation.
I think also Eugene's question goes back to your question about how do we make a more just society? If we eliminate these things, will we then have a just society? We won't. We've got these systematic produced in unions.
Yeah.
And so it's just so much
Yeah.
more of a problem.
I sort of came in here itching for a fight too. So let me just raise this issue and suggest that the identity politics of the Democratic Party is, that policy is in play with regard to hiring a small number of full-time tenured faculty at this college. The state has mandated that identity be a core key factor in determining who gets those jobs. Now, I said I was for affirmative action, and I am. But in this particular instance, the situation is this. There are already people in those jobs. So bringing someone in from St. Louis who wins the lottery, right, of the interview process, will actually displace people who are already there. That's not the way affirmative action usually works, but it would work that way with regard to this policy, right? I would prefer a much more straightforward process. Let's give every BIPOC instructor who is an adjunct automatic tenure. If you've taught 24 courses, which is the amount of courses that a tenured person has to teach before they're tenured, that for those of you who don't know what I mean, you have security. It's your job for life. Give them tenure, right?
What do you mean by BIPOC?
Remind me of the,
Black indigenous people of color.
Yeah.
What about white adjuncts?
Yeah.
There's a few of us around here.
Yeah, how do you count for Lily and Charles?
yeah, see, I provoked the wrong fight.
Hey, man, I mean,
Then you get to work on the other stuff. But first of all, that's not going to happen, right?
No.
But what I'm suggesting is that's really what would happen. I guess what I should say, first of all, is the policy as it stands is not even going to give BIPOC instructors any, there are going to be plenty of them that don't get jobs, right? This is not something that's going to solve the problem. It's going to give a few people some benefits. But absolutely, Charles, I think the ultimate goal is everybody who's taught 24 classes, they have taught 24 classes. For some reason, they keep getting hired back, right?
I think the title of your talk is Building Solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is what it's
Yeah.
everybody, man. I mean,
See why I'm not the answer? Yeah, you know, these are conversations to be hammered out by people who basically agree on the goal, but maybe are strategizing to see, well, what will the ruling class allow for,
But
right?
then you also have scarcity because you have
Yeah,
that model dependent
Yeah.
entirely upon whether or not students and culturally think that higher education is valuable.
yeah.
Right?
Well, my suggestion was more along the lines of embarrassing the state and those who made this policy than it was an actual suggestion. Because I think they are not...
capable of embarrassing.
Yeah, that's true. But they're not prepared. They're not prepared to give every BIPOC adjunct a full-time job. Simply not. They're not going to do that. But it gestures towards the situation at hand, which is most of your teachers are exploited labor. Right?
We can talk about that. This is Bill for students that are in my class that we don't know. This is State Bill HB 5227. And there's 8 tenured track positions here at UBC State.
Not a lot.
Across the state,
Yeah.
certain positions and monies were allocated from the state to hire these instructors.
Yeah.
And so if you're like not sure, we can talk more about it. And if you want more information, you can look up Washington HB 5227. It also mandates diversity, equity, and inclusion training it's tiered for new incoming faculty and staff that have been here for so much time, and then eventually it kind of trickles to students as well. So for those of you that are moving towards foreign institutions, it may or may not be relevant, but at some point you will be more exposed to what that is and what it means.
Thank you.
Obviously, talk about this here, but I would like you and I sometime to sit down, because something just occurred to me while you were talking about how trickle-down economics was going to be the savior of all people in this country, and we see where that has been. And it seems to me that identity politics might just be a form of trickle-down diversity.
Yeah.
And I'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that gestures towards two things. You'll have to remind me what you said at the beginning of there at the end, but identity politics originated with the Combahee River project, and just like anything that emanates from below that is meant to change society, elite capture is something that will happen along the way if given enough time, right? And the first part of your, the trickle down.
Yep. I don't even remember.
It doesn't work.
My mind's going like 100 miles an hour right
It's a great
Yeah.
analogy though, Eugene. Idea of trickle-down economics, the neoliberal Reagan, Bush thing, right?
I remember what I was going to say, yeah. So with regard to trickle down, it's probably worth you guys thinking about this. You know, it's important to think about policies and consequences rather than your political heroes, right? So if Reagan's your hero, you know, I would suggest thinking about other things than that. As a student at community college, I always tell my students that I went to community college way back when, and I paid $50 a semester, right? I'm always worried that I'm going to get stoned when I say that, and especially when I add that we complained about it, because it was zero before my cohort. Today, what is it? Full-time student?
A year?
Yeah, roughly.
$5,000 a year.
Yeah, it's like $5,000, something like that, for the whole year. Tuition. If you're a running start student, we'll get you eventually. But that is the consequence of politics. It's the consequence of the creation of scarce resources. It's the consequence of symbol over, you know, Reagan, the hero, restore America to greatness, that sort of thing, over the actual intentions of that cadre of politicians. Right? It's worth paying attention to those details. Right?
Could you say more about that and kind of contextualize that a little bit for the students in the room that may not?
Well, in the 1980s, it's sort of the final gasp of the New Deal coalition and the New Deal politics of more active government, right? So New Deal had presided over the creation of Social Security, and then the larger New Deal of, you know, including the Great Society and that sort of logic, and Medicare and all sorts of active government policies, the GI Bill, all kinds of stuff, which essentially created the middle class and a much more equal society. The corporate class got busy, though. They built think tanks. They leveraged money into the political system. And Reagan was sort of the product of that. Maybe Bill Clinton was the real golden product of all that, right? But the argument was, get government off my back. The 9 most frightening words in the English language are, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And that sort of logic was built into the neoliberal period that we are now seeing, I think, the end of. And again, the question is, which way are we going on that? Are we going to head towards fascism, some form of American authoritarianism? Are we already there? Or are we going to go the other direction towards social democracy? I would add one more thing about that previous version of social democracy. One soft underbelly of the New Deal model, and to some degree this isn't fair because I'm not sure it was possible at all, but it did all this reform, helped create a middle class, but it didn't really do anything to take capital from capitalists. So it left this hierarchical capitalist structure with some really nice benefits that helped create a middle class. But ruling elites bide their time. And by the 1970s, they were able to leverage economic crises to tear down much of that. So I would suggest that the next time around, we need to do something about where capital resides. And I suggest it should reside with the people. Those who work in the mills should own them. Talk about real democracy. Other questions or thoughts?
Like, own a percentage? Like, if you use that exact example, like they own a percentage.
Well, Bernie Sanders' campaign actually had a proposed policy of, as a corporation grew beyond a certain threshold, could argue over the thresholds, right? I'm not the fountain of knowledge. More and more of the stock of that company would have to go to the workers. So you still have the capitalist system, but as you grow that company over time, slowly but surely the workers have it. And they get to make decisions like, where's that company produce what it produces? Workers of Flint, Michigan, and General Motors would have appreciated that kind of power, right? They get to decide what the pay is. Maybe you don't pay CEOs 400 times more than the average line worker, right? You get to decide how work is organized, that sort of thing. That's
not
real.
Radical. That's done in other countries in a much larger.
Yeah, I guess the Mondragon company in Spain is the biggest example of this sort of thing. Right? But it's not an especially radical path. I'm sure it would be described as a radical path.
Winco?
Yeah,
Winco you own?
I'm not sure.
Grocery store Winco?
Not sure. Yeah.
Does anybody, can you even think of other examples of even American companies? I don't even know if Winco's, what is it?
Graham.
What's
It's,
Graham?
they build like big apartment buildings. They're a big contractor.
Okay. I'd like to look at those, I'd like to look at Winco, I'd like to like see sort of
Yeah.
how that functions and operates.
And I think, more power to that sort of thing. But I think, the goal would be to apply this to the system as a whole. Otherwise, you kind of leave in place the same power structures that over time will tear it all down if they can, right? We might be close to done, but are there other questions that I might answer?
Isn't there a whole, this is totally random, it doesn't feel random, but isn't there like a whole business of people buying and selling debt and bankruptcy loans?
Oh, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
like definitely further taking advantage of working class people.
Yeah, people climbing all over each other at the
Just thought about that model too.
I mean,
That's messed up.
60% of the people in this country have almost nothing. So, it's a scramble to get what you can, all right? I will provide anybody who wants it, just email me, or I've sent it to Charles, this PowerPoint. I would really highly recommend following up on some of the sources that I've listed here. The one that I had Charles, his class, watch is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th one down, Elite Capture with Ofemi Taiwo. I believe that's the one. But it might be the two of them up there. There's two of them with two similar titles, but check that out. It's like an 11-minute video. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. Great conversation.